June 4, 1942. A single Curtiss P40E Warhawk fights for altitude over the frigid water of the Aleutian chain. The pilot is Winfield E. McIntyre, flying with the 11th Fighter Squadron. He is flying a machine bearing the serial number 40-598 and the tactical tail number 98. His objective is the interception of the Japanese carrier force striking Dutch Harbor in the June 3rd and June 4th raids. But the tactical situation has collapsed. McIntyre is engaged by a Mitsubishi Zero, and the engagement has turned into a mathematical certainty of loss. The enemy fire strikes the engine cowling and the wing roots. The P-40 is a robust airframe built to absorb punishment, but the damage disrupts the oil system and ignites a fire forward of the cockpit. The engine begins to seize. The aircraft still has momentum, but it no longer has power. McIntyre faces a binary decision in a hostile environment where the air temperature alone can kill a swimming man in minutes. He cannot make it back to the steel-planked runway at Fort Glenn. He cannot bail out over the freezing ocean. His only option is a forced landing on the island itself. The terrain below is Umnak Island, a landscape defined by volcanic soil and thick tundra vegetation. From 2,000 feet, the ground looks flat and stable. This is a visual illusion common to the Aleutians. The pilot lines up his approach and makes a critical configuration choice. He lowers the landing gear. He commits his aircraft to the earth, hoping the wheels will roll out and preserve the airframe. The physics of the landing do not follow his plan. The wheels touch the surface and immediately sink into the soft peat. The resistance is instantaneous. The landing gear acts as a pivot point, and the laws of momentum take over. The crushing momentum of the aircraft slams forward. The tail rises. The nose digs in. In a violent fraction of a second, the entire machine flips over its nose and smashes down onto its back. The P-40 slides to a halt upside down. The cockpit is crushed against the tundra. The engine is smoking. The fuel lines are compromised. Upside down, the canopy usually jams under the fuselage, and any fire turns the cockpit into a furnace. McIntyre beats the odds. He manages to smash or force his way out of the inverted greenhouse and crawls onto the wet moss. He is alive. He walks away from the wreck of number 98, leaving it resting on its spine. The adrenaline fades, but the procedural consequence of the crash has just begun. A few weeks later, a U.S. Army salvage team reaches the site. They are operating under the constraints of a total war. They assess the wreckage not as a historical artifact, but as a resource inventory. They look at the inverted fuselage and see a recovery operation that requires heavy equipment they do not have. The airframe is damaged. The engine is shock-loaded. The spar is stressed. They make a resource allocation decision. They strip the wings of the 650 caliber machine guns, which are valuable and portable. They remove the radio equipment. They leave the rest. In the paperwork, the Army lists the airframe as condemned on July 3, 1942. They walk away. The war moves west towards Kiska and Attu. The Aleutian campaign ends. The Pacific War ends. The decades pass. The P-40 remains exactly where McIntyre left it. It becomes a navigational landmark for bush pilots and a rusted monument for local hikers. The aluminum skin turns dull gray. The steel fittings rust. The fabric control surfaces rot away. For more than half a century, the aircraft endures the constant scouring of the Aleutian wind and the freezing rain. It is no longer a weapon of war. It is a time capsule locked in a geological slow-motion decay. By the late 1990s, the aviation world realizes the rarity of what sits on Umnak Island. Thousands of P-40s were built, but almost none survive with their original wartime combat configuration. Most survivors are trainers or lend-lease returns. This wreck is different. It is one of the very few American aircraft shot down by Japanese forces on U.S. soil that is still accessible. It is a genuine combat veteran located in the exact spot where it fell. The objective changes from abandonment to retrieval. A coalition of historians and recovery engineers forms a plan to bring the Aleutian Tiger home. The mission is not simple. The legal boundaries have shifted. The land now falls under federal wildlife and cultural resource oversight. The site is treated as a protected historical resource. You cannot simply drag it out with a bulldozer. The recovery must be surgical. It must preserve the evidence of the crash while reversing the entropy of half a century. The team must go back to Umnak Island and solve the problem the Army engineers refused to touch in 1942. They must figure out how to pick up a 5-ton aircraft that is lying on its back without snapping it in half. The structural geometry of the Curtiss P40 is defined by its landing gear placement. It is a tail dragger design. The main wheels are positioned forward of the wing center of lift, but they are also the primary pivot point for the entire mass of the aircraft. When an aircraft lands on concrete, the brakes apply friction to the wheels and the pilot manages the deceleration to keep the tail down. When a pilot attempts to land on Aleutian tundra, the equation changes. The ground itself acts as a brake with infinite resistance. This is the mechanism of the soft field arrest. In a controlled environment, lowering the landing gear is standard procedure. On the sponge-like surface of Umnak Island, it was a calculation that ignored the density of the soil. On peat, the wheels became anchors. In an instant, forward speed turned into a pitch-over. This is a problem of lever arms and momentum. The center of gravity on a P40 Warhawk is located near the engine firewall. When the wheels lock in the mud, the kinetic energy of the moving airframe has nowhere to go. It converts into rotational torque. That torque drives the fuselage over the wheel axle in a brutal forward rotation. The tail snaps up, the nose slams down, and the propeller and cowling take first contact. In that instant, the cockpit and forward structure are hit with a vertical compression load the Warhawk was never designed to carry. In many cases, this sequence is fatal. The P40 is a heavy machine. If the ground is hard, the cockpit greenhouse crushes flat, and the pilot is pinned or killed by the impact. McIntyre survived because the same soft soil that caused the flip also cushioned the impact. The tundra absorbed the energy of the collision. The canopy glass fractured, but the steel roll bar held its shape enough to preserve a survival space. Escaping an inverted aircraft is a procedural nightmare. Hanging in the harness with the canopy buried, a pilot has seconds to get loose, find an exit, and claw into daylight. McIntyre did it, but the struggle left the Warhawk upside down and exposed, its structure already compromised. For decades, the Warhawk lay on its back. This orientation creates a unique preservation problem. Aircraft are designed to sit on their wheels. Their internal structure is built to handle gravity pulling down through the spars and struts. When you flip an airframe over, you reverse the load paths. The heavy Allison engine hangs from its mounts, pulling away from the firewall. The tail section is suspended in the air, held up only by the structural integrity of the rear fuselage skin. Gravity acts on the aluminum continuously. Over 5 decades, the airframe settled. The engine sank deeper into the mud. The cockpit filled with sediment. The tail section remained exposed to the wind, acting like a weather vane. The aluminum skin held together, but the stress accumulated. In Army terms, it was already a total loss, left to settle into the tundra. This was the state of the site when the recovery team arrived. They did not find a pristine airplane waiting to be flown. They found a structural paradox. The aircraft was preserved by the cold and the isolation, but it was geometrically locked in the wrong position. To recover it, they would have to reverse the violence of the crash. They had to understand the physics of the flip because to get the Tiger home, they would have to undo it. They could not simply lift it by the tail. If they applied force in the wrong direction, the fuselage would snap. The recovery plan had to account for the soft field arrest that buried the nose and the half-century of gravity that had weakened the spine. On the Aleutian chain, weather does the counting. For decades, the wreckage of serial number 40-598 was subjected to an environmental test that no laboratory can replicate. The climate of Umnak Island is defined by high winds and volcanic soil. The ground is composed of sharp, silica-rich ash and peat. When the wind blows across this terrain, it picks up these microscopic particles and turns the air into an abrasive medium. The atmosphere acts as a low-velocity sandblaster that runs 24 hours a day for decades. This mechanism of corrosion scouring changes the physical evidence of the crash. It does not simply rust the metal, it excavates the history painted on the surface. Aircraft paint is layered. The primer bonds to the aluminum. The factory markings are applied over the primer. Field markings are often painted over the factory layers using whatever supplies are available at the forward operating base. These layers have different chemical compositions and different hardness ratings. The wind erosion attacks the softer top layers, first peeling them away to reveal what lies beneath. This differential erosion solved a historical mystery regarding the identity of the aircraft. In the first months of 1942, United States military aircraft carried a national insignia consisting of a white star with a red circle in the center. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, commanders realized the red circle could be confused with the Japanese rising sun emblem during the chaos of a dogfight. By mid-May 1942, the order went out to paint over the red center with white paint. This was a hastily applied field modification. On the P40, the ground crews had painted out the red dot before the Battle of Dutch Harbor. But the field paint they used was less durable than the factory-applied enamel. Over 56 years, the Aleutian wind scrubbed away the white cover layer. By the time the recovery team inspected the wing in the late 90s, the original red dot had re-emerged. The environment had acted as a forensic tool, stripping away the modification and leaving a clue consistent with the early war marking transition. This was a machine from the desperate early months of the war, before the insignia changed permanently. The wind revealed other details that confirmed the unit history. The scouring exposed a vertical white stripe on the fuselage. In the dense fog of the Aleutians, visual identification was difficult. The white stripe appears to have been a local unit recognition marking, meant to help pilots pick out friend from friend in the split-second breaks in the weather. The corrosion scouring proved that this aircraft was not a generic trainer but a specific combat airframe flown by the Aleutian Tigers. The site attracted attention before the official recovery. In 1980, a future museum founder named Ted Spencer trekked to the crash. He found the aircraft largely intact, but he was not the only visitor. Sometime in the 1980s or early 90s, accounts describe an attempted private salvage at the site. The attempt illustrated the boundary between ambition and engineering reality. The would-be salvors managed to reach the wreck, but lacked the heavy lift capability to handle the inverted fuselage. That attempt left scars on the wreckage. The amateur team tried to drag or manipulate the airframe, but they were defeated by the same constraint that caught McIntyre. The soft field arrest mechanism held the aircraft fast. Without a stabilized crane or a helicopter, the P40 was effectively bolted to the island by the mud. The private team abandoned the effort, leaving the aircraft damaged but still captive. These visits confirmed the stakes. The aircraft was a verified combat veteran with unique markings revealed by the wind. It was also under threat, but that same wind was steadily consuming the aluminum skin. The illegal attempts proved that the site was vulnerable to looting. The decision logic shifted from observation to extraction. The historians knew what the aircraft was. The paint told the story of the summer of 1942. But reading the paint was the easy part. The engineering team now had to solve the geometry problem of the inverted fuselage. The recovery operation in 1999 faced a structural ultimatum. The P40 Warhawk weighs over 4 tons fully loaded. Most of that mass is concentrated in the nose where the engine and propeller assembly sit. The rest of the aircraft is a lightweight semi-monocoque shell made of aluminum skin and ribs. When the aircraft is sitting on its landing gear, gravity pushes down through the spars and struts, which are designed to take the load. When the aircraft is upside down, the load paths are reversed. This creates the problem of the inverted structural load. The fuselage is not built to support the weight of the heavy engine hanging from the firewall. For 5 decades, gravity pulled the nose assembly away from the cockpit. The aluminum skin stretched and stressed. If the recovery team attempted to lift the aircraft straight up while it was still inverted, the change in tension could cause a catastrophic failure. The tail section might snap off, or the fuselage could buckle behind the cockpit. The airframe had to be righted before it could be lifted. The engineering solution was a ground-based rotation. The team had to roll the aircraft 180 degrees along its longitudinal axis without using a crane. This is a delicate operation on soft ground. The tundra that trapped the aircraft in 1942 now acted as a friction bed. If the fuselage dragged or snagged during the roll, the aluminum would tear. The riggers inspected the hull for weak points. They found cable scars from an earlier unauthorized attempt by Paul Fox, mistakes that had already stressed the tail cone. The professional team had to work around these damage points. They wrapped the fuselage in heavy straps and used airbags and manual leverage to initiate the roll. The process was slow. The team applied torque to the wing roots and the fuselage barrel. They fought the suction of the mud. Inch by inch, the Tiger rotated. The muddy water drained from the cockpit. The crushed canopy glass fell away. For the first time in 56 years, the P-40 rested on its belly. The landing gear, which had caused the initial flip, was retracted or collapsed, allowing the aircraft to sit flat on the vegetation. With the aircraft right side up, the team faced the next constraint. The helicopter assigned to the lift had a strict payload limit. The P-40, even without fuel and ammunition, was too heavy for a single lift. The weight distribution was also a danger. A nose-heavy load is unstable under a helicopter sling. The engineers decided to break the airframe down. The primary target was the Allison V-1710 engine. This 12-cylinder liquid-cooled power plant is a dense block of steel and aluminum. It is attached to the firewall by a heavy mounting frame. The recovery team moved in to surgically detach the engine. They disconnected the control cables, the coolant lines, and the mounting bolts. They separated the power section from the fuselage. This decision solved two problems. It brought the fuselage weight down to a manageable level for the helicopter, and it removed the pendulum effect of the heavy nose. The operation had successfully converted a single 5-ton inverted wreck into two manageable loads sitting right side up. The Tiger was no longer a captive of the tundra. It was a staged payload waiting for the extraction vehicle. But the weather window in the Aleutians is always closing. The team had the geometry solved, but they still had to execute the lift before the fog returned. The extraction of the Aleutian Tiger required a specific compromise between lift capacity and fuel endurance. Umnak Island is remote. Any helicopter operating in this sector must carry enough fuel to reach the site, hover during the rigging phase, perform the lift, and transport the payload to a secure airfield. Fuel adds weight. The more fuel the helicopter carries, the less payload it can lift. The P40 Warhawk airframe, even without the engine, is a high-drag aerodynamic shape that fights the rotor wash. The engineers ran the numbers, and the margins kept shrinking: fuel, weather, and a load that could turn unstable in seconds. One all-up lift would have forced the pilot to choose between crew and artifact if anything went wrong. So the team committed to two lifts: power section first, then the airframe. The first lift targeted the power section. The Allison V-1710 engine is a dense, compact object. Its center of gravity is predictable. Once detached from the firewall, it becomes a dead weight that does not generate significant lift or drag. The riggers secured the 12-cylinder block with heavy cargo nets and nylon strops. The helicopter moved into position. The downwash flattened the surrounding tundra grass. The hook connected and the cable went taut. The engine lifted cleanly. For the first time since Dutch Harbor, part of the Warhawk flew. The helicopter ferried the engine to the staging area at Fort Glen, a few miles away. The second lift was the critical phase. The fuselage of the Warhawk is a complex structure. It is 31 feet long and has a wingspan of 37 feet. Unlike the engine, it is mostly empty space wrapped in aluminum skin. It is designed to fly at 300 miles per hour, not to hang stationary under a rotor arc. The riggers had to design a sling configuration that would hold the aircraft level. They could not use the standard lift points because of the corrosion and the structural uncertainty. Even upright, the spine still carried 56 years of upside-down stress, and the tail could twist or buckle under a dynamic sling. The rigging team used wide nylon straps wrapped around the wing roots and the forward fuselage. This cradle method distributed the lifting force across the strongest parts of the airframe, bypassing the potentially weakened bulkheads. The riggers double-checked the connections. They verified the center of gravity calculations. The fuselage had to hang slightly nose down to prevent it from acting like a kite in the slipstream. The Coast Guard helicopter returned for the second run. The noise of the rotors dominated the valley. The flight mechanic lowered the hook. The ground team connected the primary sling. The pilot began to pull collective power. The slack came out of the lines. The straps bit into the aluminum skin. The landing gear, which had dug into the mud and caused the initial flip, finally broke free of the surface. The P-40 hesitated for a second, held by the suction of the peat, and then it rose. The fuselage broke contact with the earth. It hung suspended 50 feet in the air. The pilot stabilized the load, checking for any dangerous rotation. The decision to split the weight proved correct. The aircraft was heavy but stable. The helicopter nosed forward, accelerating to build translational lift. The Tiger turned away from the crash site that had held it for 5 decades. It began the transit across the tundra, heading toward the nearest secure airfield where the wreck could be staged for the next leg of the journey. The distance from Island to the restoration facility in Anchorage is nearly 900 miles. This geographical constraint dictated the final phase of the recovery. While the helicopter crews could extract the wreckage from the tundra and move it across the island, the load could not be ferried all the way to the mainland beneath a rotor arc. To bridge the gap, the recovery team shifted from field extraction to stage transport. The Warhawk was secured, prepared for shipment, and moved onward in steps until a Lockheed C-130 Hercules could carry it to Anchorage. The aircraft was offloaded and transported to the Alaska Aviation Museum. The conservation team began the long process of stabilization. They flushed the aluminum structures with fresh water to remove the chloride salts accumulated from more than half a century of exposure to the sea air. They treated the steel fittings to arrest the corrosion. The decision to recover the aircraft has provided a return on investment that goes beyond the hardware. This airframe is one of the very few American combat aircraft shot down by Japanese forces on U.S. soil that has been recovered and preserved. It is a singular data point in the history of the Aleutian campaign. The wind-scoured paint, which revealed the red dot insignia and the vertical white stripe, is now protected from further decay. These markings are not just decoration, they are the primary source evidence anchoring the timeline of the loss. The pilot, Winfield E. McIntyre, survived the war. He did not live to see the recovery of his machine, but the aircraft he left behind in the mud is no longer a wreck rotting in isolation. It is a structural document of the desperate defense of Dutch Harbor. The engineers solved the roll, the mud, and the corrosion that had held the Tiger in place. They took condemned aluminum and made it the Aleutian Tiger again.